If someone asked you to name the most important tracks in hip-hop history, what would come to mind? You might start at the beginning, or go with the breakout hits.
I wanna rock right now.
Or maybe you think of pioneering, genre-defining tracks.
It was all a dream. I used to read Word Up magazine.
And you wouldn't necessarily be wrong, but I'm guessing that you wouldn't think of these 3 records. You may never have heard of them, but they transformed hip-hop forever, because they set the genre on a collision course with the American legal system. The late 80s and early 90s are often called the golden age of hip-hop. It was a time when every album seemed to reinvent the genre, and it was driven by an explosion of creativity and experimentation on a scale that hadn't been seen since the birth of jazz. Originally, hip-hop was born on the turntables. DJs sampled records in real time, mixing and looping break beats to fill the dance floors. By the mid-80s, the limitations of turntables had led to the adoption of the sampler and the drum machine, which were becoming more affordable and easy to use.
Some people use guitars, we use turntables and samplers. It's like this.
Just like the blues, jazz, soul, and funk, getting hold of new instruments allowed African Americans to innovate and develop new genres. But these new instruments were different from guitars and drums. A sampler doesn't produce its own sounds, it takes existing ones and recombines them. It allowed artists to chop up beats, melodies, and vocals and reassemble them into something new. All of a sudden, a poor kid from Brooklyn with access to studio equipment and a few dusty records could assemble the greatest backing band of all time. Some of the Golden Age pioneers included Public Enemy, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, the Beastie Boys, and even NWA. They were creating a new sound by weaving together obscure snippets of old records, classic break beats, and even non-musical samples like sirens, whistles, and spoken words. Listening to some of those records is like falling through a kaleidoscope of genres. Artists borrowed from anything and everything because the rulebook hadn't been written yet. But as they grew more successful, the law started to take notice.
And I sold 5 platinum. So, it's like they're gonna definitely come and get me. If my record 10 years from now went #1, I would say, yo, give me a piece of that,
See, the Golden Age was really a very brief window of time where the people who owned original rights to samples hadn't yet realized how much money that they could make from licensing. The first casualty was Biz Markie. He had sampled Gilbert O'Sullivan's Alone Again Naturally, which led to a landmark court case. The judge began his written opinion with the phrase, "Thou shalt not steal," and he characterized sampling as theft. The ruling set the precedent that all samples must be cleared with copyright holders. The effect was to make the building blocks of hip-hop prohibitively expensive. Albums like De La Soul's groundbreaking debut, 3 Feet High and Rising, contained hundreds of samples. Clearing each one would mean that a record which was made for $13,000 would have cost millions to clear. And in the end, it probably did. De La Soul was sued by 60s rock band The Turtles over a 12-second sample of the song You Showed Me. Although most cases were settled out of court, there was one that made it all the way to the highest in the land. In a hilarious twist of fate, a group whose best known use of sampling was this found themselves in front of the Supreme Court defending free speech and satire. 2 Live Crew had sampled Roy Orbison's song Pretty Woman for their song of the same name. They successfully argued that their track was a parody and therefore qualified as fair use. But as big as this victory was, most hip-hop tracks could not be considered parodies, and even if they could, the threat of litigation was too expensive to ignore. The chilling effect of these cases changed the sound of hip-hop forever, and it effectively killed the musical style we associate with the Golden Age. Hip-hop had become a victim of its own success, and as record sales grew, the price of sampling rose too. To keep making money, artists needed to learn the law and find new ways around it. Now there's 2 forms of copyright in music. Publishing rights, which are the rights to the composition, and master rights, which are the rights to the actual recording. Artists began to limit the use of samples and even hired musicians to replicate the ones they did use. Avoiding the original recording meant that they only had to pay for the publishing rights. Dr. Dre's 1992 album The Chronic popularized both of these practices, which were based on pure economics as much as musical evolution. It led to the G-Funk subgenre which dominated the mid-90s, recognizable by the stripped-back sound of 1 or 2 samples combined with live keyboards and heavy bass lines. Instead of a collage of sounds, rappers were getting their money's worth from the few samples they could afford by making them the centerpiece of the track. The Beastie Boys were another interesting case. Their 1989 album Paul's Boutique was almost entirely composed of samples, but over their next two albums they used more live instruments, returning to their punk rock roots. The fusion of rapping with live rock instruments was partly fueled by these trends, so in a way we have the Courts to thank for this guy. Many kept sampling, but chose such obscure records that no one would even notice. Another method was to chop up a sample, change the tempo and pitch, and then generally obscure it so much that it couldn't be recognized. By the end of the 90s, sampling was becoming a forgotten art in mainstream hip-hop, but artists like DJ Shadow, Jay Dilla and the Avalanches were separating sampling from rap, giving birth to instrumental hip-hop. But their music was still the product of equipment which most people couldn't afford or operate, and countless hours spent digging through crates of vinyl. But technology was reducing the money, time and effort required to do this, and that's because the end of the golden age coincided with the birth of the digital age. Today, clearing a sample is more expensive than ever, and only commercially available to music's 1%ers. But in the indie and amateur world, they are more present than ever. Every song ever recorded is available at our fingertips, and cheap laptop computers made the rise of the bedroom beatmaker possible. Sites like SoundCloud and YouTube have become havens for creators who've developed a unique, warped and distorted sound as a byproduct of trying to evade Content ID takedowns. Sampling is as old as human culture. No one knows who wrote House of the Rising Sun, Kumbaya or Rockabye Baby. Every generation adds their own twist to the lyrics, the melody or the rhythm, because that's just what people do. Hip-hop was the first genre defined by the sampling of actual records, but it was only following a long tradition of artists who built with what came before. They gave us the blueprint for what has become the greatest manifestation of sampling, the internet. Whether it be in music, art, or even memes, the internet's golden age is still going strong, even as it faces many of the same legal challenges that hip-hop did. Going back and listening to those golden age records is like hearing a snapshot in time, because they literally couldn't be made today, but they capture a period where experimentation wasn't limited by lawyers, when innovations in technology made new forms of art possible, and when hip-hop was redefining itself through incredible music.